Chapter 11 of Woman as Decoration. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Woman as Decoration by Emily Burbank. Chapter 11. 1. Woman decorative in her garden. In your garden, if you would count as decoration, keep to white or one color. The flowers furnish a variegated background against which your costume of color, gray or white, stands out. The great point is that your outline be one with pictorial value, from the artist's point of view. If merely strolling through your garden to admire it, keeping to the well-made paths, a fragile gown of sheer material and dainty shoes, with perishable hat or fragile sunshade, is in order. But if yours is the task to gather flowers, then wear stout linen or pretty, light ginghams, good to the eye and easily laundered, while resisting the briars and branches. Smocks, those loose over-all garments of soft-toned linens, reaching from neck halfway to the knees and unbelted, are ideal for garden work, and to the young and slender add a distinct charm, for one catches the movement of the lithe form beneath. You can be decorative in your garden in a large enveloping apron of gingham, if you are wise in choosing a color which becomes you. One lover of flowers, who has an instinct for fitness and color, may be seen on a summer morning, trimming her porch boxes in snowy white, shoes and all, over which she wears a big encircling apron, extending from neck to skirt hem. Deep pockets cross the entire front, convenient for clippers, scissors, and twine. This apron is low-necked, with shoulder straps and no sleeves. The woman in question is tall and fair, and on her soft curling hair she wears sun hats of peanut straw, the edges sewn over and over with wool to match her gingham apron, which is a solid pink, pale green, or lavender. Dark women look uncommonly well in khaki color, and so do some blondes. Here is a shade decorative against vegetation, and serviceable above all. Garden costumes for actual work vary according to individual taste and the amount and character of the gardening indulged in. Lady de Bath (Mrs. Langtry) owns one of the most charming gardens in England, though not as famous as some. It is attached to Regal Lodge, her place at Newmarket. The Blue Walk is something to remember, with its walls of blue lavender flanking the blue paving stones, between the cracks of which lovely bluebells and larkspur spring up in irrelevant, poetic license. Lady de Bath digs and climbs and clips and gathers, therefore she wears easily laundered garments. A white linen or cotton skirt and blouse, a Chinese coat to the knees, of pink cotton crepe, and an Isle of Jersey sunbonnet, a poke with curtain to protect the neck, and strings to tie it on. So while she claims never to have consciously considered being a decorative note in her own garden, her trained instinct for costuming herself appropriately and becomingly brings about the desirable decorative effect. 2. Woman decorative on the lawn. When on your lawn with the unbroken sweep of green underfoot and the background of shrubs and trees, be a flower or a bunch of flowers in the color of your costume. White, hat, shoes, and all, cannot be excelled, but color has charm of another sort, and turning the pages of memory, one realizes that not a shade or artistic combination but has scored, if the outline is chic. Since both outline and color scheme vary with fashion, we use the word chic or smart to imply that quality in a costume which is the result of restraint in the handling of line, color, and all details, whatever the period. A chic outline is very telling on the lawn. Gown or hat must be appropriate to the occasion, becoming to the wearer, its lines following the fashion, yet adapted to type, and the color one sympathetic to the wearer. The trimming must accentuate the distinctive type of the gown or hat, instead of blotting out the lines by an overabundance of garniture. The trimming must follow the constructive lines of gown, or have meaning. A buckle must buckle something, buttons must be used where there is at least some semblance of an opening. Let us repeat. To be chic, the trimming of a hat or gown must have a raison d'être. When in doubt, omit trimming. As in interior decoration, too much detail often defeats the original idea of a costume. An observing woman knows that few of her kind understand the value of restraint. When turned out by an artist, most women recognize when they look their best, but how to achieve it alone is beyond them. This sort of knowledge comes from carefully and constantly comparing the gown which is a success to those which are failures. Elimination characterizes the smart costume or hat, and the smart designer is he or she who can make one flower, one feather, one bow of ribbon, band of fur, bit of real lace or hand embroidery, say a distinct something. It is the decorative value gained by the judicious placing of one object so that line and color count to the full. As we have said in interior decoration, one pink rose in a slender Venetian glass vase against a green silk curtain may have far more decorative value than dozens of costly roses used without knowledge of line and background. So it is with ornaments on wearing apparel. 3. Woman decorative on the beach. With a background of gray sand, steel blue water, and more or less blue sky, woman is given a tempting opportunity to figure as color when by the sea. That it is gay color or white which makes decorative effects on the beach, even the least knowing realize. Plein air artists have stamped on our mental visions impressions of smart society disporting itself on the sands of Dieppe, Trouville, Brighton, or where not. Whatever the period, hence outline, white, and the gay colors impress one. Most conspicuous is white on woman and man; then each color in the rainbow with its half tones, figures as sweaters, veils, hats, and parasols; the striped marquees and gay wares of the vendors of nosegays, balloons, and lollipops. The artist picks out the telling notes when painting, learn from him and figure as one of these. On the beach avoid being a dull note. Dead grays and browns have no charm there. What is true of costuming for the beach applies equally to costumes to be worn on the deck of a steamer or yacht. End of chapter 11.
Luminous Decoration. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ellie. Woman as Decoration by Emily Burbank. Chapter 12. Woman as Decoration when skating. To be decorative when skating, two things are necessary. First, know how to skate. Then see to it that you are costumed with reference to appropriateness, becomingness, and the outline demanded by fashion of the moment. The woman who excels in the technique of her art does not always excel in dressing her role. It is therefore with great enthusiasm that we record Miss Theresa Weld of Boston, holder of Women's Figure Skating Championship, as the most chickly costumed woman on the ice of the Hippodrome, New York, where amateurs contested for the cup offered by Mr. Charles B. Dillingham on March 23, 1917, when Miss Weld again won, this time over the men as well as the women. Miss Weld combined good work with perfect form, and her edges, fronts, ins, threes, double threes, etc., etc., were a delight to the eye as she passed and repassed in her wine-colored velvet, trimmed with moleskin, a narrow band at the bottom of her full skirt, full to allow the required amount of leg action, deep cuffs, and a band of the same fur encircling the close velvet toque. This is reproduced as the ideal costume because, while absolutely up-to-date in line, material, color, and character of fur, it follows the traditional idea as to what is appropriate and beautiful for a skating costume, regardless of epoch. We have seen its ancestors in many parts of Europe year after year. Some of us recall with keen pleasure the wonderful skating in Vienna and Berlin on natural and artificial ice, invariably hung with flags and gaily lighted by night. We can see how those German girls, some of them trim and good to look at in costumes of sapphire blue, deep red, and green velvet, fur trimmed, gliding swiftly across the ice to the irresistible swing of waltz music and accompanied by flashing uniforms. In the German-speaking countries everyone skates. The white-bearded grandfather and the third generation going hand in hand on Sunday mornings to the nearest ice pond. With them, skating is a communal recreation, as beer garden concerts are. With us in America, most sports are fashions, not traditions. The rage for skating during the past few seasons is the outcome of the exhibition skating done by professionals from Austria, Germany, Scandinavian countries, and Canada at the New York Hippodrome. Those who madly danced are now as madly skating, and out of town the young women delight the eye in bright wool sweaters, broad, long wool scarfs, and bright wool caps, or small, close felt hats, fascinating against the white background of ice and snow. The boots are high, reaching the top of calf, a popular model having a seam to the tip of the toe. No sport so perfectly throws into relief command of the body as does skating. Watch a group of competitors for honors at any gathering of amateur women skaters, and note how few have command of themselves, know absolutely what they want to do, and then are able to do it. One skater, in the language of the eyes, can do the actual work but has no form. It may be she lacks temperament, has no abandon, no rhythm, is stiff, or while full of life has bad arms. It is as necessary that the fancy skater should learn the correct position of the arms as that the solo dancer should. Certain lines must be preserved, say, from fingers of right arm through to tip of left foot, or from tip of left hand through to tip of right foot. Form is the manipulation of the lines of the body to produce perfect balance, perfect freedom, and, when required, perfect control in arrested motion. This is the mastery which produces in free skating that melting of one figure into another which so hypnotizes the onlooker. It is because Mrs. Weld has mastered the above qualifications that she is amateur champion in fancy skating. She has mastered her medium, has control of every muscle in her body. In consequence, she is decorative and delightful to watch. To be decorative, when not on skates, whether walking, standing, or sitting, a woman must have cultivated the same feeling for line, her form must be good. It is not enough to obey the ABCs of position, head up, shoulders back, chest out, stomach in. One must study the possibilities of the body in acquiring and perfecting poses which have line, making pictures with one's self. In the art of interior decoration, we insist that every room be a beautiful composition. What we would now impress upon the mind of the reader is that she is a part of the picture and must compose with her setting. To do this, she should acquire the mastery of her body, and then train that body until it has acquired good habits in the assuming of line, whether in action or repose. This can be done to an astonishing degree, even if one lacks the instinct. To be born with a sense of line is a gift, and the development of this sense can give artistic delight to those who witness the results, and thrill them quite as sculpture or music or any other art does. The Greek idea of regarding the perfectly trained body as a beautiful temple is one to keep in mind if woman would fulfill her obligation to be decorative. Form means efficiency, if properly understood and carried out according to the spirit, not to the letter of law. Form implies the human body under control, ready for immediate action. The man or woman with form will be the first to fall into action when required, because, so to speak, no time is lost in collecting and aiming the body. One of the great points in the teaching of the late Theodore Leschitsky, the world's greatest master in the art of piano playing, was that the hand should immediately assume the correct position for the succeeding chord, the instant it was lifted from the keys. Preparedness. The crack regiments of Europe, noted for their form, have for years been the object of jests in those new worlds where brawn and muscle, with mental acumen, have converted primeval forests into congested commercial centers. But that form, so derided by the pioneer spirit, has proved its worth during the present European war. The United States and the Central Powers are now at war, and military guards have been stationed at vulnerable points. Only today we saw one of Uncle Sam's soldiers, one of three, patrolling the front of a big armory, standing in an absolutely relaxed position, his gun held loosely in his hand and his bayonet propped against the iron fence. One could not help thinking, no form, no preparedness, no efficiency. It goes without saying that prompt obedience cannot be looked for where there is a lack of form, no matter how willing the spirit. The modern woman, when on parole, walking, dancing, driving, riding, or engaging in any sport, to be efficient must have trained the body until it has form, and dress it appropriately, if she would be efficient as well as decorative in the modern sense of the term. No better illustration of our point can be found than in the popular sport cited at the beginning of this chapter. End of chapter 12. Recording by Ellie, July 2009.
Of Woman as Decoration. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Corey Samuel. Woman as Decoration by Emily Burbank. Chapter 13. Woman decorative in her motor car. It is not easy to be decorative in your automobile now that the manufacturers are going in for gay colour schemes, both in upholstery and outside painting. A putty-coloured touring car lined with red leather is very stunning in itself, but the woman who would look well when sitting in it does not carelessly don any bright motor coat at hand. She knows very well that to show up to advantage against red and be in harmony with the putty colour paint, her tweed coat should blend with the car, also her furs. Black is smart with everything, but fancy how impossible mustard, cerise, and some shades of green would look against that scarlet leather. An orange car with black top, mudguards and upholstery calls for a costume of white, black, brown, tawny grey, or, if one would be a poster, royal blue. Some 25 years ago, the writer watched the first automobile in her experience driven down the Champs-Élysées. It seemed an uncanny, horseless carriage built to carry 4 people and making a good deal of fuss about it. A few days later, while lunching at the Café des Reservoirs, Versailles, we were told that some men were starting back to Paris by automobile, and if we went to a window giving on to the court, we might see the astonishing vehicle make its start. It was as thrilling as the first near view of an aeroplane, and, all excitement, we watched the 2 Frenchmen getting ready for the drive. Their elaborate preparation to face the current of air to be encountered en route was not unlike the preparation today for flying. It was spring, June at that, but those Frenchmen wearing very English tweeds and smoking English pipes each drew on extra cloth trousers and coats, and over these a complete outfit of leather. We saw them get into the things in the public courtyard, arrange huge goggles, draw down cloth caps, and set out at a speed of about 15 miles an hour. The above seems incredible, now that we have passed through the various stages of motor car improvements and motor clothes creations. The rapid development of the automobile, with its windshields, limousine tops, shock absorbers, perfected engines and springs, has brought us to the point where no more preparation is needed for a 1,000-mile run across country with an average speed of 30 miles an hour than if we were boarding a train. One dresses for a motor as one would for driving in a carriage, and those dun-coloured lineless monstrosities invented for motor use have vanished from view. More than this, woman today considers her decorative value against the electric blue velvet or lovely chintz lining of her limousine, exactly as she does when planning clothes for her salon. And why not? The manufacturers of cars are taking seriously their interior decoration as well as outside painting, and many women interior decorators specialize along this line and devote their time to inventing color schemes calculated to reflect the personality of the owner of the car. Special orders have raised the standard of the entire industry, so that at the recent New York Automobile Show, many effects in cars were offered to the public. Besides the putty-coloured roadster lined with scarlet, black lined with russet yellow, orange lined with black, there were limousines painted a delicate custard colour, with top and rim of wheels, chassis and lamps of the same nattier blue as the velvet lining, cushions and curtains. A beautiful and luxurious background, and how easy to be decorative against it to one who knows how. Another popular colour scheme was a mauve body with top of canopy and rims of wheels white, the entire lining of mauve like the body. Imagine your woman with a decorative instinct in this car. So obvious an opportunity would never escape her, and one can see the vision on a summer day as she appears in simple white, softest blue or pale pink, or better still, treating herself as a quaint nosegay of bluish roses, forget-me-nots, lilies and mignonette, with her chiffons and silks or sheerest of lawns. But how about me? One hears from the girl of the open car, a racer perhaps, which she drives herself. You are easiest of all, we assure you. To begin with, your car, being a racer, is painted and lined with durable dark colours, battleship grey, dust colour, or some shade which does not show dirt and wear. The consequence is, You will be decorative in any of the smart coats, close hats and scarfs in brilliant and lovely hues, silk or wool. End of chapter 13.
Chapter 14 of Woman as Decoration. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Woman as Decoration by Emily Burbank. Chapter 14. How to Go About Planning a Period Costume. Here is a plan to follow when getting up a period costume. We will assume that you wish to wear a Spanish dress of the time of Philip IV, early 17th century. The first thing to give your attention to is the station of life which you propose to represent. Granted that you decide on a court costume, one of those made so familiar by the paintings of the great Velasquez, let your first step be to get a definite impression of the outline of such a costume. Go to art galleries and look at pictures, go to libraries and ask for books on costumes, with plates. You will observe that under the head of crinoline and hoop skirt periods, there are a variety of outlines markedly different. The slope of the hip line and the outline of the skirt is the infallible hallmark of each of these periods. Let it be remembered that the outline of a woman includes hair, combs, headdress, earrings, treatment of neck, shoulders, arms, bust and hips, line to the ankles and shoes; also fan, handkerchief, or any other article, which if a silhouette were made, would appear. The next step is to ascertain what materials were available at the time your costume was worn, and what in vogue. Were velvets, satins, or silks worn, or all three? Were materials flowered, striped, or plain? If striped, horizontal or perpendicular? For these points turn again to your art gallery, costume plates, or the best of historical novels. If you are unable to resort to the sources suggested, two courses lie open to you. Put the matter into the hands of an expert. There are many to be approached through the columns of first-class periodicals or newspapers (we do not refer to the ordinary dealer in costumes or theater accessories), or make the effort to consult some authority, in person or by letter, an actor, historian, or librarian. It is amazing how near at hand help often is, if we only make our needs known. If the reader is young and busy, dancing and skating and sleeping, and complains, in her winsome way, that "days are too short for such work," we would remind her that as already stated, to carefully study the details of any costume, of any period, means that the mind and the eye are being trained to discriminate between the essentials and non-essentials of woman's costume in everyday life. The same young beauty may be interested to know that at the beginning of Geraldine Farrar's career the writer, visiting with her an exhibition of pictures in Munich, was amazed at the then very young girl's familiarity with the manner of artists, ancient and modern, and exclaimed, "I did not know you were so fond of pictures." "It's not that," Farrar said. "I get my costumes from them, and a great many of my poses." Outline and material being decided, give your attention to the character of the background against which you are to appear. If it is a ballroom, and the occasion a costume ball, is it done in light or dark colors, and what is the prevailing tone? See to it that you settle on a color which will be either a harmonious note or an agreeable, hence impressive contrast, against the prevailing background. If you are to wear the costume on a stage or as a living picture against a background arranged with special reference to you, and where you are the central figure, be more subtle and combine colors, if you will. Go in for interesting detail, provided always that you make these details have meaning. For example, if it be trimming, pure and simple, be sure that it be applied as during your chosen period. Trimming can be used so as to increase effectiveness of a costume by accentuating its distinctive features, and it can be misused so as to pervert your period, whether that be the age of Cleopatra or the winter of 1917. Details, such as lace, jewels, head dresses, fans, snuff boxes, work baskets and flowers, must be absolutely of the period, or not at all. A few details, even one stunning jewel, if correct, will be far more convincing than any number of makeshifts, no matter how attractive in themselves. Paintings, plates, and history come to our rescue here. If you think it dry work, try it. The chances are all in favor of your emerging from your search spellbound by the vistas opened up to you, the sudden meaning acquired by many inanimate things, and a new pleasure added to all observations. That Spanish comb of great-great-grandmother's is really a treasure now. The antique Spanish plaque you own, found to be Moorish luster, and out of the attic it comes. A Spanish miracle cross proves the spiritual superstition of the race, so back to the junk shop you go, hoping to acquire the one that was proffered. Yes, Carmen should wear a long skirt when she dances, Spanish pictures show them, and so on. The collecting of materials and all accessories to a costume puts one in touch, not only with the dress, but the life of the period, and the customs of the times. Once steeped in the tradition of Spanish art and artists, how quick the connoisseur is to recognize Spanish influence on the art of Holland, France, and England. Lead your expert in costumes of nations into talking of history, and we promise you pictures of dynasties and lands that few historical writers can match. This man or woman has extracted from the things people wore the story of where they wore them, and when, and how. For the lover of color, we commend this method of studying history. If any one of our readers is casting about for a hobby, and craves one with inexhaustible possibilities, we would advise, try collecting data on periods in dress, as shown in the art treasuries of the world, for of this there is verily no end. We warn the novice in advance that each detail of woman's dress has for one in pursuit of such data the allure of the siren. There is the pictured story of head dresses and hats, and how the hair is worn, from Cleopatra's time till ours; the evolution of a woman's sleeve, its ups and downs, and ins and outs, as shown in art; the separation of the waist from skirt, and ever-changing line of both; the neck of woman's gown so variously cut and trimmed, and how the necklace changed likewise to a cord; the passing of the sandals of the Greeks into the poetic glove-fitting slippers of today. One sets out gaily to study costumes, full of the courage of ignorance, the joyous optimism of an enthusiast, because it is amusing and looks so simple with all the material, old and new, lying about one. Ah, that is the pitfall, the very abundance of those plates in wondrous books, old colored prints and portraits of the past. To some students this kaleidoscopic vision of period costumes never falls into definite lines and color. Or if the types are clear, what they come from or merge into remains obscure. For the eager beginner we have tried to evolve out of the whole mass of data a system of origin and development as definite as the anatomy of the human body, a framework on which to build. If our historical outline be clear enough to impress the mental vision as indelibly as those primary maps of the earth did, then we feel persuaded the textless books of wonderful and beguiling costume plates will serve their end as never before. We humbly offer what we hope may prove a key to the rich storehouse. Simplicity and pure line were lost sight of when overabundance dulled the senses of the world. We could prove this, for art shows that the costuming of woman developed slowly, persevering, as did furniture, the same classic lines and general characteristics until the 15th century, the end of the Middle Ages. With the opening up of trade channels and the possibilities of easy and quick communication between countries, we find, as we did in the case of furniture, periods of fashion developing without nationality. Nations declared themselves in the artistry of workmanship, as today, and in the modification and exaggeration of an essential detail, resulting from national or individual temperament. If you ask, where do fashions come from, why periods? We would answer that in the last analysis one would probably find in the conception of every fashion some artist's brain. If the period is a good one, then it proves that fate allowed the artist to be true to his muse. If the fashion is a bad one, the artist may have had to adapt his lines and color or detail to hide a royal deformity, or to cater to the whim of some wilful beauty ignorant of our art, but rich and in the public eye. A fashion if started is a demon or a god let loose. As we have said, there is an interesting point to be observed in looking at woman as decoration. Whether the medium be fresco, bas relief, sculpture, mosaic, stained glass or painting, the decorative line, shown in costumes, presents the same recurrent types that we found when studying the history of furniture. For our present purposes it is expedient to confine ourselves to the observation of that expression of civilization which had root, so far as we know, in Assyria and Egypt, and spread like a branching vine through Byzantium, Greece, Rome, Gothic Europe and Europe of the Renaissance, on through the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, down to the present time. Costumes for woman and man are supposed to have had their origin in a cord tied about the waist, from which was suspended crude implements, used for the slaying of beasts for food and in self-defense; trophies of war, such as teeth, scalps, etc. The trophies suspended partly concealed the body and were for decoration, as was tattooing of the skin. Clothes were not the result of modesty; modesty followed the partial covering of the human body. Modesty, or shame, was the emotion which developed when man, accustomed to decoration, trophies or tattooing, was deprived of all or part of such covering. What parts of the body require concealment is purely a matter of the customs prevailing with a race or tribe at a certain time and under certain conditions. This is a theme, the detailed development of which lies outside the purpose of our book. It has delightful possibilities, however, if the plentiful data on the subject, given in scientific books, were to be condensed and simplified. Chapter 14
of Woman as Decoration. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julie van Maljem. Woman as Decoration by Emily Burbank. Chapter 15. The Story of Period Costumes. A Resume. Our present modes of dress, aside from the variations imposed by fashion, are the resultant of all the fashions of the last 2,000 years. W. G. Sumner, in Folkways. The earliest Egyptian frescoes, invaluable prehistoric data, show us woman as she was costumed, housed and occupied when the painting was done. On those age-old walls she appears as man's companion, his teacher, plaything, slave and ruler, in whatever role the fates decreed. The same frescoed walls have pictured records of how Egypt tilled the soil, built houses, worked in metals, pottery and sculpture. Woman is seen beside her man, who slays the beast, at times from boats propelled through reeded jungles, and hers is always that rigid outline, those long quiet eyes depicted in profile, with massive headdress and strange upstanding ornaments, abnormally curled wig, and close straight garments to the feet, or none at all, heavy collar, wristbands and anklets of precious metals with gems inset, or chased in strange designs. About her the calm mysterious poise and childlike acquiescence of those who know themselves to be the puppets of the gods. In this naivete lies one of the great charms of Egyptian art. As sculptured caryatide, we see woman of Egypt clad in transparent sheath-like skirt, nude above the waist, with the usual extinguishing headdress and heavy collar, bracelets and anklets. We see her as woman, mute, law-abiding, supporting the edifice, woman with a steady gaze and silent lips. One wonders what was in the mind of that lotus-eater of the Nile who carved his dream in stone. Those who would reproduce Egyptian color schemes for costumes, house or stage settings, would do well to consult the Book of Egyptian Designs, brought out in 1878 by the École des Beaux-Arts, Paris, and available in the large libraries. On the walls of the necropolis of Memphis, T and his wife, 5th dynasty, appear in a delightful hunting scene. The man in the prow of his boat is about to spear an enormous beast, while his wife, seated in the bottom, wraps her arm about his leg. Among the earliest portraits of an Egyptian woman completely clothed is that of Queen Taia, wife of Amenophis, 18th dynasty, who wears a striped gown with sleeves of the kimono type and a ribbon tied around her waist, the usual ornamental color, and bracelets of gold, and an elaborate head-dress with deep blue curtain extending to the waist behind. Full of illuminating suggestions is an example of woman in Egyptian decoration to be seen as a fresco in the necropolis of Thebes. It shows a governess of a young prince, 18th dynasty, holding the child on her lap. The feet of the little prince rest on a stool, supported by 9 crouching human beings, men. Each has a collar about his neck, to which a leash is attached, and all 9 leashes are held in the hands of the child. The illustrations of the Egyptian funeral papyrus, the Book of the Dead, show a woman in the role of wife and companion. It is a story of a high-born Egyptian woman, Tutu, wife of Ani, royal scribe and scribe of the sacred revenue of all the gods of Thebes. Tutu, the long-eyed Egyptian woman, young and straight, with raven hair and active form, a chemate of Amen, which means she belonged to the religious chapter or congregation of the great god of Thebes. She was what might be described as lady-in-waiting, or honorary priestess to the god Amen. She, too, wears the typical Egyptian headdress and straight long white gown hanging in close folds to her feet. One vignette shows Tutu with arm about her husband's leg. This seems to have been a naive Egyptian way of expressing that eternal womanliness, the tender care for those beloved, that quality inseparable from woman if worthy the name, and by reason of which, with man, her mate, she has run the gamut of human experience, meeting the demands of her time. There is no dodging the issue. Woman's story recorded in art shows that she has always responded to fate's call, followed, led, ruled, been ruled, amused, instructed, sent her men into battle as Spartan mothers did to return with honor or on their shields, and when fate so decreed, led them to battle, like Joan of Arc. 2. Egypt and Assyria. In Egypt and Assyria, the lines of the torso were kept straight, with no contracting of body at waistline. Woman was clad in a straight sheet-like garment, extending from waist to feet with only metal ornaments above, necklace, bracelets and armlets, or a straight dress from neck to meet the heavy anklets. Sandals were worn on the feet. The head was encased in an abnormally curled wig, with pendant ringlets, and the whole clasped by a massive headdress, following the contour of head, and having as part of it a curtain or veil reaching down behind, across shoulders and approaching waistline. The Sphinx wears a characteristic Egyptian headdress. 3. Egypt, Byzantium, Greece and Rome. During the periods antedating Christ, when the Roman Empire was all-powerful, the women of Egypt, Byzantium, Greece and Rome wore gilded wigs, see Plate 1, frontispiece, arranged in Psyche knots and banded, sandals on their feet, and a one-piece garment, confined at the waist by a girdle, which fell in close folds to the feet, a style to develop later into the classic Greek. The Greek garment consisted of a great square of white linen, draped in the deft manner of the East, to adapt it to the human form, at once concealing and disclosing the body to a degree of perfection never since attained. There were undraped Greek garments left to hang in close clinging folds, even in the classic period. It is this undraped and finely pleated robe, see Plate 21, hanging close to the figure, and the two-piece garment, see Plate 4, with its short tunic of the same material, extending just below the waistline in front, and drooping in a cascade of ripples at the sides, as low as the knees, that Fortuny, Paris, has reproduced in his tea-gowns. An Englishwoman told us recently that her great-great-grandmother used to describe how she and others of her time, Empire period, wet their clothes to make them cling to their forms à la grecque. The classic Greek costume was often a sleeveless garment, falling in folds, and when confined at waistline with cord, the upper part bloused over it. The material was draped so as to leave the arms free, the folds being held in place by ornamental clasps upon the shoulders. The fitting was practically unaided by cutting, squares or straight lengths of linen being adjusted to the human form by clever manipulation. The adjusting of these folds, as we have said, developed into an art. The use of large squares or shawls of brilliantly dyed linen, wool, and lady silk is conspicuous in all the examples showing woman as decoration. The long Gothic cape succeeded, that enveloping circular garment with and without a hood, and clasped at the throat, in which the Mother of God is invariably depicted. Her cape is a celestial royal blue. The stained silk gauzes, popular with Greek dancers, were made into garments following the same classic lines, and so were the gymnasium costumes of the young girls of Greece. Isadora Duncan reproduces the latter in many of her dances. In the chapter entitled The Story of Textiles in the Art of Interior Decoration, we have given a resume of this branch of our subject. The type of costume worn by woman throughout the entire Roman Empire during its most glorious period was classic Greek, not only in general outline but in detail. Note that the collarless neck was cut round and a trifle low. The lines of gown were long and followed each other. The trimming followed the hem of neck and sleeves and skirt. The hair, while artificially curled and sometimes intertwined with pearls and other gems, after being gilded, was so arranged as to show the contour of the head, then gathered into a Psyche knot. Gold bands, plain or jewelled, clasped and held the hair in place. In the Gold Room of the Metropolitan Museum, in noted collections in Europe, in portraits and costume plates, one sees that the earrings worn at that period were great heavy discs or half-discs of gold, large gold flowers in the Etruscan style, large rings with groups of pendants, usually 3 on each ring, and the drop earrings, so much in vogue today. Necklaces were broad, like collars, round and made of hand-wrought links and beads, with pendants. These filled in the neck of the dress, and were evidently regarded as a necessary part of the costume. The simple cord, which confined the Greek woman's draperies at the waist, in Egypt and Byzantium became a sash, a broad strip of material which was passed across the front of body at the waist, crossed behind and brought tight over the hips to tie in front, low down, the ends hanging square to knees or below. In Egypt, a shoulder cape with kerchief effect in front, broadened behind to a square and reached to the waistline. We would call attention to the fact that when the classic type of furniture and costume were revived by Napoleon I and the Empress Josephine, it was the Egyptian version as well as the Greek. One sees Egyptian and Etruscan styles in the straight, narrow garment of the First Empire, reaching to ankles, with parallel rows of trimming at the bottom of skirt. The Empire style of parted hair, with cascade of curls each side, righteous curling locks outlining face, with 1 or 2 ringlets brought in front of ears, and the Psyche knot, which later in Victorian days lent itself to caricature, in a feather duster-affected crown of head, were inspired by those curled and gilded creations, such as Thais wore. Hats, as we use the term today, were worn by the ancients. Some will remember the Greek hat Sybil Sanderson wore, with the classic robes when she sang Massenet's Phèdre in Paris. It was Chinese in type. One sees this type of hat on Tanagra statuettes in our museums. Apropos of hats, designers today are constantly resurrecting models found in museums, and some of us recognize the lines and details of ancient headdresses in hats turned out by our most up-to-date milliners. Parasols and umbrellas were also used by Assyrians and Greeks. Sandals, which only covered the soles of the feet, were the usual footwear, but Greeks and Etruscans are shown in art as wearing also moccasin-like boots and shoes laced up the front. Of course, the strapped slippers of the empire were a version of classic sandals. As we have said, the Greek gown and toga are found wherever the Roman Empire reached. The women of what are now France and England clothed themselves at that time in the same manner as the cultured class of Rome. Naturally, the Germanic branch, which broke from the parent stem and drifted northward to strike root in unbroken forests bordering on undried seas, wore skins and crudely woven garments, few and strongly made, but often picturesque. Though but slightly reminiscent of the traditional costume, we know that women of the 3rd and 4th centuries wore a short one-piece garment with large earrings, heavy metal armlets above the elbow and at wrists. The chain about the waist, from which hung a knife for protection and domestic purposes, is descended from the savage's court and ancestor to that lovely bauble, the chatelaine of later days, with its attached fan, snuff-box, and jewelled watch. End of chapter 15.
Of Woman as Decoration. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jennifer Stearns. Woman as Decoration by Emily Burbank. Chapter 16. Development of Gothic Costume. To the Romans, all who were not of Rome and her empire were foreigners, outsiders, people with a strange viewpoint. So they were given a name to indicate this. They were called barbarians. Conspicuous among those tribes of barbarians, moved by human lust for gain to descend upon the Roman Empire and eventually bring about its fall, was the tribe of Goths. And in the course of century, Gothic has become a generic term, implying that which is not Roman. We speak of Gothic architecture, Gothic art, Gothic costumes, when we mean, strictly speaking, the characteristic architecture, art, and costuming of the late Middle Ages, 12th to 15th centuries. But we find the so-called Gothic outline in costume as early as the 4th century. Over the undraped one-piece robe of classic type, a second garment is now worn, cut with straight lines. It usually fastens behind, and the uncorseted figure is outlined. The neck is still collarless and cut round, the space filled in with a neckline. The sleeves of the tunic appear to be the logical evolution of the folds of the toga, which fall over the arms when bent. They cling to the outline of the shoulder, broadening at the hand into what is called angel sleeves. In art, the traditional angel wears them. Roman Christian women wore their hair parted, no Psyche knot, and interesting large earrings. The gowns were not draped, but were in one piece with no fullness. A tunic, following lines of the form, reached below the knees and was belted. This garment was trimmed with bands from shoulders to hem of tunic, and kept the same width throughout. If narrow, but if wide, the bands broadened to the hem. The neck continued to be cut round, and filled in with a neckline. The cape, fastening on shoulders or chest, remnant of the Greek toga, was worn, and veils of various materials were the usual head coverings. Between the 5th and 10th centuries there are examples of the overgarment or tunic having a broad stomacher of some contrasting material, held in place with a cord, which is tied behind, brought around to the front, knotted and allowed to hang to bottom of skirt. Byzantine art between 800 and 1000 A.D. still shows women wearing tunics, but hanging straight from neck to hem of skirt, fastened on shoulders and opened at sides to show gown beneath. Close sleeves with trimming at the wrists, often large, roughly cut jewels forming a border on tunic, and the hair worn in long braids on each side of the face. The coil of hair, which was wrapped with pearls or other beads, was parted and used to frame the face. This fashion was carried to excess by the Franks. We see some of their women between 400 and 600 A.D., wearing these heavy rope-like braids to the hem of the skirt in front. In the 14th century, the Gothic costume was perhaps at its most beautiful stage. The long robe, the upper part following the lines of the figure, with long close sleeves half covering hands, or flowing sleeves that touched the floor. About the waist was worn a silk cord or jeweled girdle, finely wrought and swung low on hips, from the end of which was suspended the money bag, fan, and keys. The girdle begins now to play an important part as decoration. This theme, the evolution of the girdle, may be indefinitely enlarged upon, but we must not dwell upon it here. In some cases we see that the tunic opened in the front, and that the large square shawl-like outer garment of Greece now became the long circular cape, clasped on the chest, one or two clasps, made so familiar by the art of the Gothic and Renaissance periods. Turn to the illuminated manuscripts of those periods, to paintings on wood, frescoes, stained glass, stucco, carved wood, and stone, and you will find the Mother of God invariably costumed in the simple one-piece robe and circular clasped cape. In the most sacred art of the 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, the Virgin and other saints are depicted in the current costume of woman. The Virgin was the most frequent subject of artists in every medium during the ages when the Church dominated the state in Europe. The furnishing of the Virgin's wardrobe has long been, and still is, a pious task and one clamored for by adherents to the churches in which the Virgin's image is displayed to worshippers. We regret to say, for aesthetic reasons, that there is no effort made on the part of modern devotees to perpetuate the beautiful medieval type of costume. In some old paintings which come under the head of folk art, the Holy Family appears in national costume. The writer recalls a bit of 18th century painting showing St. Anne holding the Virgin as child. St. Anne wears the bizarre fête attire of a Spanish peasant, a gigantic headdress and veil, large earrings, wide stiff skirts showing gay flowers on a background of gold. The skirt is rather short to display wide trousers below it. Her sleeves have filmy frills of deep white lace executed with skill. To return to the girdle, as we have said, it slipped from its position at the waistline, where it confined the classic folds, and was allowed to hang loosely about the hips, clasped low in front. From this clasp a chain extended, to which were attached the housewife's keys or purse and the dame of fashion's fan. In fact, one can tell, to a certain extent, the woman's class and period by carefully inspecting her chatelaine. The absence of waistline and the long, straight effect produced in the body of gown by wearing the girdle swung about the hips gives it the so-called Moyen Age silhouette, revived by the fashion of today. In the 13th century, the round, collarless neck, low enough to admit a neckline of links or beads, persists. A new note is the outer sleeve laced across an inner sleeve of white. Let us remember that the costume of the 13th and 14th centuries was distinguished by a quality of beautiful sweeping line, massed color, detail with raison d'être, which produced dignity with graceful movement found nowhere today, unless it be on the Wagnerian stage or in the boudoir of a woman who still takes time, in our age of hurry, to wear her negligee beautifully. In the 14th century the round neck continued, but one sees low necks too, which left the shoulders exposed. Our 1830 style. Another new note is the tunic grown into a garment reaching to the feet, a one-piece princess gown with belt or girdle. Sometimes a Juliet cap was worn to merely cover the crown of head, with hair parted and flowing, while on matrons we see head coverings with sides turned up, like ecclesiastical caps, and floating veils falling to the waist. Notice that through all the periods that we have named, which means until the 14th century, the line of shoulder remains normal and beautiful, sloping and melting into folds of robe or line of sleeve. We see now for the first time an inclination to tamper with the shoulder line. An inoffensive scallop appears, or some other decoration, as cap to sleeve. No harm done yet. The 15th century shows another style, a long, sleeveless overgarment, reaching to the floor, fastened on shoulders and swinging loose, to show at sides the undergown. It suggests a priest's robe. Here we discover one more of the Moyen Age styles revived today. The 14th century gowns with necks cut out round to admit a necklace with pendants are still popular. The gowns are long on the ground, and the most beautiful of the characteristic headdresses, the long, pointed one, with veil covering it, and floating down from point of cap to hem of floating skirt behind, continues the movement of costume, the long lines which follow one another. When correctly posed, this pointed headdress is a delight to the eye. We recently saw a photograph of some fair young woman in this type of medieval or Gothic costume, worn by them at a costume ball. Failing to realize that the pose of any headdress, this means hats as well, is all important, they had placed the quaint, long, pointed caps on the very tops of their heads, like fools' caps. The angle at which this headdress is worn is half the battle. The importance of every woman's cultivating an eye for line cannot be overstated. In the 15th century we first see puffs at the elbow, otherwise the outlines of gown are the same. The garment in one piece, the body of it outlining the form, its skirts sweeping the ground, a girdle about the hips, and long, close or flowing sleeves, wide at the hem. Despite the 14th century innovation of necks cut low and off the shoulders, berated by the Church, most necks in the 15th century are still cut round at the throat, and the necklace worn instead of collar. Some of the gowns cut low off the shoulders are filled in with a puff tucker of muslin. The pointed cap with a floating veil is still seen. Notice that the restraint in line, color, and detail gradually disappears, with the abnormal circulation of wealth in those departments of church and state to which the current of material things was diverted. We now see humanity tricked out in rich attire and staggering to its doom through general debaucheries. Rich brocades, once from Damascus, are now made in Venice, and so are wonderful satins, velvets, and silks, with jewels many and massive. Sometimes a broad, jewelled band crossed at the breast from shoulder diagonally to underarm at waist. The development of petticoat begins now. At first we get only a glimpse of it, when Our Lady of the Pointed Cap lifts her long skirts, lined with another shade. It is of a rich contrasting color, and is gradually elaborated. The waistline, when indicated, is high. A new note is the hair, with throat and neck completely concealed by a white veil, a style we associate with nuns and certain folk costumes. As fashion it had a passing vogue. Originally, the habit of covering woman's hair indicated modesty, an ideal held among the folk, and the gradual shrinking of the dimensions of her coif records the progress of the peasant woman's emancipation in certain countries. This is especially conspicuous in Brittany, as M. Anatole Lebras, the eminent Breton scholar, remarked recently to the writer. Note the silk bag, quite modern, on the arm, also the jewelled line of chain hanging from girdle down the middle of front to hem of skirt, both for use and ornament. To us of a practical era, a mysterious charm attaches to the long pointed shoes worn at this period. In the 15th century the marked division of costume into waist and skirt begins, the waistline more and more pitched in, the skirt more and more full, the sleeves and neck more elaborately trimmed, the headdresses multiplied in size, elaborateness, and variety. Textiles developed with wealth and ostentation. In the 16th century the neck usually cut out and worn low on the shoulders. Sometimes filled in, but we see also high necks, necks with small ruffs and necks with large ruffs, ruffs turned down, forming stiff linen cape collars, trimmed with lace, close to the throat or flaring from neck to show the throat. The hair is parted and worn low in a snood, or, by young women, flowing. The ears are covered with the hair. The Virgin in art. When writing of the Gothic period, in the Art of Interior Decoration, we have said, Gothic art proceeds from the Christian Church, and stretches like a canopy over Western Europe during the late Middle Ages. It was in the churches and monasteries that Christian art, driven from pillar to post by wars, was obliged to take refuge, and there produced that marvellous development known as the Gothic style, of the Church, for the Church, and by the Church, perfected in countless Gothic cathedrals, crystallized glorias, lifting their manifold spires to heaven, ethereal monuments of an intrepid faith which gave material form to its adoration, its fasting and prayer, in an unrivalled art. Crystallized glorias, hymns to the Virgin, is as concise a defining of the nature and spirit of this highest type of medieval art, perfected in France, as we can find. Here we have deified woman inspiring an art miraculously decorative. Chartres Cathedral and Rheims, before the German invasion in 1914, with Mont Saint Michel, are distinguished examples. If the reader would put to the test our claim that woman as decoration is a beguiling theme worthy of days passed in the broad highways of art, and many an hour in cross-roads and unbeaten paths, we would recommend to them the fascinations of a marvellous story-teller, one who, knowing all there is to know of his subject, has had the genius to weave the innumerable and perplexing threads in a tapestry of words, when the main ideas take their places in the foreground, standing out clearly defined against the deftly woven, intelligible, but unobtruding background. The author is Henry Adams, the book The Cathedrals of Mont Saint Michel and Chartres. He tells you in striking language how woman was translated into pure decoration in the Middle Ages, woman as the Virgin Mother of God, the manifestation of deity which took precedence over all others during the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries, and if you will follow him to the Chartres Cathedral, particularly if you have been there already, and will stand facing the great east window, where in stained glass of the ancient jewelled sort, woman, as Mother of God, is enthroned above all, he will tell you how, out of the chaos of warring religious orders, the priestly schools of Abelard, St. Francis of Assisi, and others, there emerged the form of the Virgin. To woman as Mother of God and man, the instrument of reproduction, of tender care, of motherhood, the disputatious, groping mind of man agreed to bow, silenced and awed by the mystery of her calling. In view of the recent enrolling of womanhood in the stupendous business of the war now waging in Europe, and the demands upon her to help in arming her men or nursing back to life the shattered remains of fair youth, which so bravely went forth, the thought comes that woman will play a large part in the art to arise from the ashes of today. Woman as woman, ready to supplement man, pouring into life's cauldron the best of herself, unstinted, unmeasured, woman capable of serving beyond her strength, rising to her greatest height, bending but not breaking to the end, if only assured she is needed. End of chapter 16. Recording by Jennifer Stearns, Concord, New Hampshire.
Of woman as decoration. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J.C. Guan. Woman as Decoration by Emily Burbank. Chapter 17. The Renaissance. 16th and 17th centuries. The marked departure is next cut square, and elaborate jewelled chains draped from shoulders, outlining neck of gown and describing a festoon on front of waist, which is soon to become independent of skirt to develop on its own account. As in the 15th century, when necks were cut low off the shoulders, they were on occasion filled in with tuckers. The skirt now registers a new characteristic. It parts at the waistline over a petticoat, and the opening is decorated by the ornamental, heavy chain which hangs from girdle to hem of gown. One sees the hair still worn coiled low in the neck, concealing the ears and held in a snood, or in Italy cut Florentine fashion with fringe on brow. Observe how the wealth of the Roman Empire, through its new trade channels opening up with the East, the result of the Crusades, led to the importation of rich and many-colored Oriental stuffs. The same wealth ultimately established looms in Italy for making silks and velvets, to decorate man and his home. There was no longer simplicity in line and color scheme. Gorgeous apparel fills the frames of the Renaissance, and makes amusing reading for those who consult old documents. The clothes of man, like his over-ornate furniture, shows a debauched and vulgar taste. Instead of the lines which follow one another, solid colours and trimmings kept to hem of neck and sleeve and skirt, great designs in satins and velvet brocades distort the lines and proportions of man and woman. The good Gothic lines lived on in the costumes of priests and nuns. Jewelry ceased to be the decoration with meaning. Lace and fringe, tassels and embroidery, with colour combinations to rival the African parrots, disfigured man and woman alike. During November of 1916, New York was so fortunate as to see, at the American Art Galleries, the great collection of late Gothic and early Renaissance furniture and other art treasures, brought together in the restored Davanzati Palace of Florence, Italy. The collection was sold at auction, and is now scattered. Of course, those who saw it in its natural setting in Florence were most fortunate of all. But with some knowledge and imagination, all the sight of those wonderful things, handmade all of them, the most casual among those who crowded the galleries for days must have gleaned a vivid impression of how woman of the early Renaissance lived, in her kitchen, dining-room, bedroom, and reception-rooms. They displayed her cooking utensils, her chairs and tables, her silver, glass, and earthenware, her bed, linen, satin damask, lace and drawn work, the cushions she rested against, portraits in their gorgeous Florentine frames, showing us how those early Italians dressed, the colored terracottas, unspeakably beautiful presentments of the Virgin and Child, molded and painted by great artists under that same exaltation of faith which brought into being the sister arts of the time, imbuing them with something truly divine. There is no disputing that quality which radiates from the face of both the mother and the child. One all but kneels before it. Their expression is not of this world. That is woman as the mother of God in art, woman as the mother of man, who looked on these inspired works of art, lived for the most part in small houses built of wood with thatched roofs, unpaved streets, dirty interiors, which were cleaned but once a week, on Saturdays. The men of the aristocracy hunted and engaged in commerce, and the general rank and file gave themselves over to the gaining of money to increase their power. It sounds not unlike New York today. Gradually the cities grew large and rich. People changed from simple, sober living to elaborate and less temperate ways, and the great families, with their proportionately increased wealth, gained through trade, built beautiful palaces and built them well. The gorgeous coloring of the frescoed walls shows Byzantine influence. In the art of interior decoration we have described at length the house furnishing of that time. Against this background moved woman, man's mate. Note her color scheme, and then her role. We quoted from John Rusconi in Les Arts, Paris, August 1911. Donna Francesca dei Albizzi's cloak of black cloth, ornamented on a yellow background with birds, parrots, butterflies, pink and red roses, and a few other red and green figures, dragons, letters, and trees in yellow and black, and again other figures made of white cloth with red and black stripes. Extravagance ran high not only in dress but in everything. Laws were made to regulate the amount spent on all forms of entertainment, even on funerals, and the cook who was to prepare a wedding feast had to submit his menu for approval to the city authorities. More than this, only 200 guests could be asked to a wedding, and the number of presents which the bride was allowed to receive was limited by law. But wealth and fashion ran away with laws. The same old story. As the tide of the Renaissance rose and swept over Europe, the awakening began in Italy. The woman of the gorgeous cloak and her contemporaries, according to the vivid description of the last quoted author, were "subject to their husband's tyranny, not even knowing how to read in many cases, occupied with their household duties, in which they were assisted by rough and uncouth slaves, with no other mission in life than to give birth to a numerous posterity. This life ruined them, and their beauty quickly faded away. No wonder, then, that they summoned art to the aid of nature. The custom was so common and the art so perfect that even a painter like Taddeo Gaddi acknowledged that the Florentine women were the best painters in the world. Considering the mental stages of women, it is easy to imagine to what excesses they were given in the matter of dress." The above assertions relate to the average woman, not the great exceptions. The marriage coffers of women of the Renaissance in themselves gave an idea of her luxurious taste. They were about 6 feet long, 3 feet high, and 2½ feet deep. Some had dome covers opening on hinges. The whole was carved, gilded, and painted, the background of reds and blues throwing the gold into relief. Scenes taken from mythology were done in what was known as pastille, composition work raised and painted on a gold background. On one 15th century marriage coffer, Bacchus and Ariadne were shown in their triumphal car drawn by winged griffins, a young Bacchante driving them on. Another coffer, decorated in the same manner, had as decoration "the rape of Proserpine." Women rocked their infants in sumptuous carved and emblazoned walnut cradles, and crimson satin damask covered their beds and cushions. This blaze of gold and silver, crimson and blue, we find as the wake of Byzantine trade via Constantinople, Venice, Rome, Florence, on to France, Spain, Germany, Holland, Flanders, and England. Carved wood, crimson, green, and blue velvets, satin damask, tapestries, gold and silver fringe and lace. Against all this moved woman, costumed sumptuously. Gradually the line of woman's and man's neck is lost in a ruff, her sweeping locks, instead of parted on her brow, entwined with pearls or other gems to frame her face and make long lines down the length of her robe, are huddled under grotesque headdresses, monstrous creations, rising and spreading until they become caricatures defying art. In some 16th century Italian portraits we see the ruff flaring from a neck cut out square and low in front, then rising behind to form a head covering. The last half of the 16th century is marked by gowns cut high in the neck, with a close collar, and the appearance of a small ruff encircling the throat. This ruff almost at once increased to absurd dimensions. The tightly laced, long pointed bodice now appears, with and without padded hips. The superlative degree of this type is to be seen in portraits by Velasquez. Long pointed toes to the shoes give way to broad, square ones. Another 16th century departure is the absurdly small hat, placed as if by the wind at a careless angle on the hair, which is curled and piled high. Also we see hats of normal size with many plumes, on both men and women. Notice the sleeves. Some are still flowing, with tight undersleeves, others slashed to show full white sleeve beneath. But most important of all is that the general license, moral and artistic, lays its ruthless hand on woman's beautiful, sweeping shoulder line and distorts it. Anne of Cleves, or the progressive artist who painted her, shows in a portrait the queen's flowing sleeves with medieval lines, clasped by a broad band between elbow and shoulder, and then pushed up until the sleeve forms an ugly puff. A monstrous fashion this, and one soon to appear in 1,000 mad forms. Its first vicious departure is that small puffy, senselessly insinuated line between armhole and top of sleeve in garments for men as well as women. Skirts button from point of basque to feet just before we see them, in the 17th century, parting down the front and separating to show a petticoat. In Queen Elizabeth's time the acme of this style was reached by Spanish women, as we see in Velasquez's portraits. Gradually the overskirt is looped back, at first only a few inches, and tied with narrow ribbons. The second quarter of the 17th century shows the waistline drawn and bodice with skirts a few inches in depth. These skirts are the hallmark of a basque. Very short, full coats, flaring from underarms now appear. After the skirt has been pushed back and held with ribbons, we find gradually all fullness of upper skirt, pushed to hips to form paniers, and across the back to form a bustle effect, until we have the Marie Antoinette type, last 18th century, far more graceful and séduisant than the costume of Queen Elizabeth's time. The figures presented by Marie Antoinette and her court, powdered wigs and patches, paniers and enormous hats, surmounting the horsehair erections, heavy with powder and grease, lace, ribbon, flowers, and jewels, are quaint, delightful, and diverting, but not to be compared with the Greek or medieval lines in woman's costume. Extremely extended skirts gave way to an interlude of full skirts, but flowing lines in the 18th century English portrait. The Directoire reaction towards simplicity was influenced by English fashion. Empire formality under classic influence came next, when Victorian hoops, which were succeeded by the Victorian bustles, pantalettes, black velvet at throat and wrists, and lockets. End of chapter 17. Read by J.C. Guan, Montreal, July 2009. Of Women as Decoration. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J.C. Guan. Woman as Decoration by Emily Burbank. Chapter 18. 18th Century. The 18th century is unique by reason of scientific discoveries, mechanical inventions, and chemical achievements, coupled with the gigantic political upheaval of the French Revolution. It is unique, distinguished, and enormously fruitful. For example, the modern frenzy for chintz, which has made our homes burst into bloom in endless variety, had its origin in the 18th century looms at Jouy, near Versailles, under the direction of Oberkampf. Before 1760 silks and velvets decorated man and his home. Royal patronage cooperating with the influence of such great decorators as Percier and Fontaine gave the creating of beautiful stuffs to the silk factories of Lyons. Printed linens and painted wall-papers appeared in France simultaneously, and for the same reason. The Revolution set mass taste, which is often stronger than individual inclination, toward unostentatious, inexpensive materials for house furnishing and wearing apparel. The Revolution had driven out royalty and the high aristocracy, who, with changed names, lived in seclusion. Society, therefore, to meet the mass desire, was driven to simple ways of living. Men gave up their silks and velvets and frills, lace and jewels for cloth linen and sombre neckcloths. The women did the same. They wore muslin gowns and their own hair, and went to great lengths in the affectation of simplicity and patriotic fervor. We hear that, apropos of America having at this moment entered the great struggle with the Central Powers, simplicity is decreed as smart for the coming season, and that those who costume themselves extravagantly, furnish their homes ostentatiously, or allow their tables to be lavish, will be frowned upon as bad form and unpatriotic. These reactions are inevitable, and come about with the regularity of tides in this world of perpetual repetition. The belles of the Directorate shook their heads and bobbed their pretty locks at the artificiality Marie Antoinette and company had practised. I fear they called it sinful art to deftly place a patch upon the face, or make a headdress in the image of a man of war. Madame de Staël's familiar headdress, twisted and wrapped around her head à la Turque, is said to have had its origin in the improvisation of the court hairdresser. Desperately groping for another version of the top-heavy erection, to humor the lovely queen, he seized upon a piece of fine lace and muslin hanging on a chair at hand, and, twisting it, wrapped the thing about the towering wig. As it happened, the chiffon was my lady's chemise. We begin the 18th century with a full petticoat, trimmed with rows of ruffles or bands, an overskirt looped back into paniers to form the bustle effect, the natural hair powdered, the hairdress of lace, standing out stiffly in front and drooping in a curtain behind. It was not until the whim of Marie Antoinette decreed it so, that the enormous powdered wigs appeared. Viennese temperament alone accounts for the moods of this lovely tragic queen, who played at making butter, in cap and apron, over simple muslin frocks, but outdid her artificial age in love of artifice, not art, in dress. This gay and dainty puppet of relentless fate, propelled by varying moods, must needs lose her lovely head at last, as symbol of her time. End of chapter 18. Read by J.C. Guan, Montreal, July 2009. Chapter 19 of Women as Decoration. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J.C. Guan. Women as Decoration by Emily Burbank. Chapter 19. Women in the Victorian Period. The first 70 years of the 19th century seem to us, of 1917, absolutely incredible in regard to dress. How our great-great-grandmothers ever got about on foot, in a carriage or stage-coach, moved in a crowd, or even sat in any measure of serenity at home, is a mystery to us of an age when comfort, convenience, fitness, and chic have at last come to terms. For a vivid picture of how our American society looked between 1800 and 1870, read Miss Elizabeth McClellan's Historic Dress in America, published in 1910 by George W. Jacobs and Company, of Philadelphia. The book is fascinating, and it not only amuses and informs, but increases one's self-respect, if a woman, for modern women, dressed in accordance with her role. We can see extravagant wives point out with glee to tyrants' maids how, in the span of years between 1800 and 1870, our maternal forebears made money fly even in the Quaker City. Fancy paying in Philadelphia at that time $1,500 for a lace scarf, $400 for a shawl, $100 for the average gown of silk, and $50 for a French bonnet. Miss McClellan, quoting from Mrs. Roger Pryor's memoirs, tells how she, Mrs. Pryor, as a young girl in Washington, was awakened at midnight by a note from the daughter of her French milliner to say that a box of bonnets had arrived from Paris. Mamma had not yet unpacked them, and if she would come at once, she might have her pick of the treasures, and Mamma not know until too late to interfere. And this was only back in the 50s, we should say. Then think of the hoops and wigs and absurdly furbished head-dresses, paper-soled shoes, some intended only to sit in, bonnets enormous, laces of cobweb, shawls from India by camel and sailing craft, rouge too, and hair-grease, patches and powder, laced waists and cramped feet, low necks, and short sleeves for children in schoolrooms. Man was then still decorative here and in Western Europe. Today he is not decorative, unless in sports clothes or military uniform. Women's garments furnish all the color. Whistler circumvented this fact when painting Theodore Duret, Metropolitan Museum, in somber black broadcloth, modern evening attire, by flinging over the arm of Duret the delicate pink taffeta and chiffon cloak of a woman, and in Mr. Duret's hand he places a closed fan of pomegranate red. End of chapter 19. Read by J.C. Guan, Montreal, July 2009. Of Women as Decoration. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J.C. Guan. Woman as Decoration by Emily Burbank. Chapter 20. Sex in Costume. European dress is the term accepted to imply the costume of man and woman which is entirely cosmopolitan, decrying continuity of types of costume and thoroughly plastic in the hands of fashion. Today we say parrot-like, that certain materials, lines and colors are masculine or feminine. They are so merely by association. The modern costume of man the world over, if he appear in European dress, we accept court regalia, is confined to cloth, linen or cotton, in black, white, and inconspicuous colors, a prescribed and simple type of neckwear, footwear, hat, stick, and haircut. The progenitor of the garments of modern men was the Lutheran Puritan revolutionary garb, the hallmark of democracy. It is true that when silk was first introduced into Europe from the Orient, the Greeks and early Romans considered it too effeminate for man's use. But this had to do with the doctrine of austere denial for the good of the state. To wear the costume of indolence implied inactivity and induced it. As a matter of fact, some of the master spirits of Greece did wear silks. In ancient Egypt, Assyria, Media, Persia, and the Far East, men and women wore the same materials, as in China and Japan today. Egyptian men and their contemporaries throughout Byzantium wore gowns in outline identical with those of the women. Among the Turks, trousers were always considered as appropriate for women as for men, and both men and women wore over the trousers a long garment not unlike those of the women in the Gothic period. Thais wore a gilded wig, but so did the men she knew, and they added gilded false beards. Assyrian kings wore earrings, bracelets, and wonderful claps with chains, by which the folds in their draped garments, cut like the woman's, might be caught up and held securely, leaving feet, arms, and hands free for action. When the genius of the Byzantine, Greek, and Venetian manufacturers of silks and velvets, rich in texture and ablaze with color, were offered for sale to the Romans, whose passion for display had increased with their fortunes and consequent lives of dissipation, we find there was no distinction made between the materials used by man and women. It is no exaggeration to say that the Renaissance spells brocade. Great designs and small ones sprawled over the figures of man and woman alike. Lace was as much his as hers to use for wide, elaborate collars and cuffs. Embroidery belonged to both, and the men, like the women, of Germany, France, Italy, and England wore many plumes on their big straw hats and metal helmets. The intercommunication between the Orient and all of the countries of the Western Hemisphere, and the abundance and variety of human trappings bewildered and vitiated taste. Unfortunately, the change in line of costume has not moved parallel to the line in furniture. The revival of classic interior decoration in Italy, Spain, France, Germany, England, etc., did not at once revive the classic lines in women's clothes. End of chapter 20. Read by J.C. Guan, Montreal, July 2009.